Tall Tales. The Nymph Symphony.
Chapters.
Chapter 8. Eye of the Storm. After the calm before the storm came the storm. The screams began all at once, an orchestra of pleas and cries, fear manifesting into a physical form as the ghostly gnoll predators finally came out from the misty shadows to wreak their blood-hungry assault upon these poor villagers. It was horrible, the gnolls using their long razor claws to yank out young townsfolk from their barricaded houses, pillaging all the food crates still left stacked by the port. Desperate men and women setting their own houses alight just to scare the creatures back into the darkness. Zephyr, our leaping marksman, was the first to intervene, bombarding the gnolls with a blanket of burning arrows. His attacking speed was incredible. "Get out of here," he screamed to the townsfolk, lunging off the rooftop and into the overcrowding streets. "Go to the tavern," I overheard him say, yelling at the fleeing nymphs while he aggravated enough of the gnolls to chase him instead. He leaped back up to the church bell tower for more safety and advantage, 5 of the gnolls climbing up after him, digging their claws into the brick and mortar as they scaled the church walls effortlessly in pursuit. The biggest and fattest of the bunch pouncing onto the tower only a few seconds after Zephyr had got up there himself, quickly becoming the first victim to one of Zephyr's powerful compressed front kicks. The pressure of such a collision, sending this beast into the sky and soaring over the town, pushing the very limits of my own vision as I watched the bulky beast become just a dot that disappeared into the darkness of the black ocean ahead. The spring-legged archer returned back to the streets with a rooftop dive, struggling to evade the other gnolls who charged into the top of the roof at him. Zephyr simply trying to keep some distance from the swarms of gnolls pouncing at him, their mindless collisions breaking crates, spilling fruity contents onto the street, instantly diverting all attention away from this marksman as the gnolls started scratching and howling at each other for the scattered raw meals. Some gnolls still swiped at Zephyr, a few grabbing hold of him as he was once again forced into flight, pulling them with him as he leaped into the air, dropping them from a tremendous height while he shot arrows at the ground, clearing the gnolls away so he could land. Gnolls literally disappearing with the wind long before the arrows hit the ground, most of their dark leathery hoods peeling off to reveal nothing but dark mist underneath. It was almost as if the gnoll had suddenly disintegrated into a colorless void of space. I couldn't believe what I saw, but I had no time to rationalize why these creatures were disappearing like ghosts. All that mattered to me was whether or not we still seemed in control, and quite frankly, when looking out at all the fires and madness below me, I could hardly believe this battle had only started but half a minute ago. We were already overrun. I could see pockets of army soldiers doing their best to build a resistance in the little alleyways. Some tiny distant versions of us slipping through the streets undetected as they sought out refugees to save, only to be scouted by the gnolls, who were flooding in from all 4 corners of their sight. I saw a villager tunneling into the ground, trying to escape its 4-legged aggressors, plucked out of his hole by a gnoll somehow managing to outdig his very talented opponent, only to drag him out before the rest of their horde. This unfortunate stray soldier smothered by the crowd until he had merely vanished from all sight, right along with the gnoll that had initially attacked him. "Where did they go?" I asked the coney in a fluster, confused at how they could simply disappear without any sudden scream or noise. I thought if anyone could give me an answer, it would be the brainiac beside me. I don't know," he answered, sharing in my bewilderment. "Maybe my mother knows," he then speculated, considering his mother's own talents for teleporting in and out of worldly phase. It was staggering to see how rapidly the streets were overcome. Battles lasted mere milliseconds, so it would appear. Akoni and I were spectators to this poor town slowly falling into flames. The 2 of us watching gnolls throwing crates through windows, attempting to continue pulling hidden civilians out into the streets, pushing them all into a circle of howling gnolls. their war cry scaring all defiance from the imprisoned townsfolk as they slumped and simply waited to disappear like all the others. Unfortunately, even the marketplace was overrun, with gnolls surrounding it, putting stray soldiers in a spot of serious strife as they continued trying to evacuate townsfolk into the thick boarded-up tavern that sat in the very center of town. Camila was furiously shifting about, wielding a huge bladed lance. She swung it in clockwork spirals, deflecting the gnolls as they swiped at her from left and right. The pull of her banners deflected the attacks coming towards her from behind, and her armor sparked as sharp claws struck against it like metal on metal. The town seemed all but lost. Oconee looked devastated as he watched his mother slowly losing her fight against the gnolls. Thankfully, Odie came rolling to her defense, flattening gates and crushing chairs as he created a path for Camila to escape down. Despite not being able to control his movements, he managed to reach the marble marketplace stone on her behalf. Camila then climbed the steps shortly afterwards, heading up to her husband's old gateway device. I tried to see what was happening, but Oconee was hogging the glasses, and the clouds were becoming thicker and thicker, plunging the town deeper into darkness. With it becoming so dark I could barely see my hands. The soldiers were keeping to the safety of scattered fires, their only viable means of light, while the gnolls continued to ransack the darker sides of town. In the distance, I saw an agua blue light and knew it was the marble gateway charging up. That meant Camila had reached her portal device. Judging by the squawks and shrieks resonating from that area, I think it was safe to say she'd already used the device to transport herself back to the castle. It was obvious that this horde had been hell-bent on stopping her, but blinking from one point to another, she must have eluded enough of their lunging paws in order to make it through the stone and out the other side, sending herself, and possibly a few dumb stragglers holding on to her, back into the radiant light of our castle's dusk, via the marble stone's linking wormhole network. It was a moment of pure relief for Oconee and me to know his mother was all right, and that her plan to get back to the castle for reinforcements had succeeded. We'd hopefully only have to withstand the gnolls' forces for a couple more minutes before the king and queen would come to save everyone. Midas had built these unique stones for Camila, who was the only one capable of using them, placing one in every town of the borderlands as a way to unite all the tribes. They meant his castle could offer aid to other tribes quickly and readily, if they ever found themselves in situations as dire as this. I tried to see what was happening now that the soldiers had lost their leader. My sight was restricted to the various house fires, the only areas that illuminated the darkness. Some resilient nymphs, such as the blacksmith I'd seen earlier, were trying to fight off the gnolls, bravely defending their families in town. I had no idea how many people had made it to the tavern, nor how many soldiers were left defending its doors. I kept an eye on one particular family as they snuck out from where they'd been hiding and crept along the deserted streets towards this gated-off estate. Gnolls stalked along the rooftops above them, silently following the family, those scared farmers slowly dooming us as they led the stragglers to this high-rise beach estate. Arlo waved his hands invitingly from beside the gates he was ordered to close, prompting the family to hurry up. Seeing him, the gnolls immediately pounced, jumping out from windows and off rooftops, tackling the poor family and pinning them down, just like they'd done to me in the swamps. Both children had managed to squeeze themselves from the gnolls' grasp and continue to run away, while their parents remained pinned down, fighting just to give them that chance to escape. Gnolls chased after the children and forced them away from the safety of Reuben's strong, spiky metal villa gates, watching them disappear around the alleyway corner instead, pursued by only a few stragglers that continued to chase. Most of them were now focused on the prince guarding the half-open gate. All heart and no head, the prince abandoned his post, rushing to give aid to the parents far ahead in the center of the main back street, running underneath a passage of roof-dwelling monsters as they drooled and dropped down in added pursuit, the vast majority of his pack closing in on him as he sprinted into the pack, still restraining the unfortunate wife and husband. With only a minor few still remaining up on the rooftops, watching over the gnolls below, revealing some strange but obvious sense of hierarchy or leadership amongst these pack hunters. Pulling out his blade, the prince swung it backwards and forwards in blind defense, the gnolls backing up ever so slightly as more came in to surround him. The fires all along the side streets were reflecting their light into Arlo's bright new crystal sword, glowing it with a fiery blood red that seemed to scare the gnolls. It appeared the sword had been built with very similar solar technology to Helios's pointy spherical staff, and the sunspire that inspired it. Arlo waved his infernal glowing sword, spooking away the gnolls, who reacted as if he were waving hellfire toward them. He freed the trapped parents, giving them the chance to run while he bravely backpedaled his own way to freedom. The gnolls had forfeited their fight for the moment, waiting for his back to turn and release them from the strict circle of confinement he was trying to creep out of. His bright sword was slowly losing its glare as each step took him further and further away from the fires. My prince was having to deflect a few eager gnolls as they clawed at him, too impatient to wait. Enough to spook the parents as they bolted under the ivy vines of a half-open gate just ahead of him. That gate locking shut as the parents abandoned him and sprinted off past it, their own sudden movements causing the gnolls to dash towards the prince, while he remained pinned behind the gates and this immediate horde. "Open it for him!" Akoni and I yelled down to the frightened family as Arlo battled to fend off the gnolls pouncing at him. But the two parents were already too far from the gates. A few small scavenging gnolls began climbing the long pointy vine gates. One managed to cling on and scaled over them, not concerned about the thorns scratching at them. Catastrophic, as our prince was also far too distracted to even notice the stray gnoll as it dived over and landed softly against a pit of sand on our side of the protective fence. Its arrival made me just as scared for Arlo as I was them for myself. I couldn't understand why Arlo still wanted to be out there. From the distance, it looked easy for him to jump himself over that spiky gate and get away. And yet, he was still there, caught deflecting attacks left, right, and center. Finally, Arlo did jump into the air, another moment of relief for us, as I figured he must have seen the stray gnoll heading up the hill towards us and was about to chase it. But then he didn't jump over the gates. He landed back in the same spot, plunging his sword, up to its hilt, into the ground with an earth-shattering tremble, the sword convulsing in his hands, shaking the ground enough to rock the gnolls like a tremor or earthquake, cracks opening beneath the creature's feet as the earth erupted and imploded with a giant uplift of rock and dirt, rumbling like a volcanic fissure as the largest rocks spewed out under the pressure of that hot, vibrating sword. Soot and ash covered much of the nearby area, blinding even my sight as Arlo shielded himself with a sound field, hiding in the debris of floating rock hazards as they continued to spurt from the ground. On first glance, the fight appeared completely unfair, but after that display I was starting to think the gnolls were the outmatched ones. With Arlo, it never mattered how many foes surrounded him. He was somebody who appeared to work better when he was pushed into a cage. Admirably, though, the gnolls charged towards him nevertheless, only to be beaten down without consequence. Confidently, Arlo continued to skip and skid in circles, skating across freshly powdered gravel, acting as if this fight was one poetic blade dance, luring and charming victims with his own serpent-like rhythm. The prince's cockiness had put me into some ease as I turned my attention to look back towards the gnoll on the beach and the parents trying to sprint up that long sandy hill towards the manor. I quickly gazed at the streets, trying to see if I could spot the children. I thought about slipping out undetected to go look for them. I wanted to do something brave, but I had a bad feeling they were most likely going to be another candle to the Nyx shrines, considering the odds against them. I wasn't able to act on that impulse regardless, though, considering how quickly the parents made it up to Akoni and me, getting far enough ahead of the gnoll, which was still, thankfully, down on the beach, slipping against the sand as it attempted to rough its way up the steep dunes of those many hills. I opened my mouth to tell the parents I'd help find their children, but before I could even speak, the children appeared by the start of those gates, The little brother and his younger sister squeezing inside with hands linked and tears held back as Inara secretly ushered them in. These children becoming ecstatic when she pointed towards her breathless parents way up the hill beside us. Unaware of the stalking creature still climbing the sands just below the proper pathing. To our horror, the gnoll quickly changed its direction, prowling towards its closer targets, the children, leaping down with a great finesse as it no longer had to battle upwards over each bumpy dune that led off track towards the large beach house. There were no soldiers up here, no one to save the children from that gnoll. I realized this was my moment to be brave, adrenaline poisoning my bloodstream as I started running down the hill. The nervous anticipation of not knowing exactly what I was going to do had begun overcharging my senses. Although after looking behind me and seeing a pool of shadows ready to fester, I knew I was ready for this. For once I was in a position of visible strength, the flickering embers of distant house fires doing me great justice as for the first time in history, I finally felt ready to show some true courage and valor. I picked up some speed, trying to match the gnoll's speed as it silently charged towards our oblivious princess and the children. I carefully widened my arms, waving them through the air as a means to expand my own clawing shadow, remembering just how quick gnolls can leap and just how fast I needed to be in order to react in righteous time. And as quick as a screech, I had to confine my arms back to my side, my reflexes jumping me as I tried to settle myself back down and lower a racing heartbeat. I watched the running gnoll illuminate like a candle before tumbling immediately down, blasted off a small canyon divide mid-air as it attempted to leap from one mound to another. A loud crackling noise had blasted in my ear, and a hot violet flash of light had caused this gnoll to be sent off and back towards the sand dunes against the ivy-covered side gates. A magic missile flaming as it had whistled past me, splashing the gnoll with an unearthly raw concussive power. A compound of fire, lighting and frost all looking like it merged into one. Akoni's exotic purple flame had been pressurized and ejected out of his little broomstick hand pistol, its barrel still smoking from the tiny missile's launch. Akoni kept his gun aimed at the ready, prepared to fire at the gnoll again. But the mysterious and mystic flame vaporized the gnoll's shroud, revealing nothing inside. The creature was gone, dissipated like all the others. "Arlo, pull back!" Akoni shouted to his best friend. Too dumb to be afraid, the prince stubbornly refused to listen, choosing to keep the gnolls bottled down there against his own poor positioning. Even if it meant risking a stray loose foot, that would be the death of him. Playing with his wristband, Akoni's backpack began to clunk and brighten, power diverting out of his gun before the backpack rocketed him past a young family while he tried to hover with it, wonkily shiziming from one side to the other, before eventually shooting up like a star, with 2 purple jet trails of flame spurting out from the backpack's turbines. What is he thinking? I asked myself. How did Akoni suddenly consider himself an expert after one lucky hit on an unsuspecting target? I wanted to shout out for him to come back and not be a careless moron, but he was too far above me already, blasting into the anonymity of the foggy dark sky. Finally managing to gain enough control to drop down and hover just over the gates, he fired out warning shots at the ground near Arlo and his aggressors. I had to admire his courage. Akoni could have used his jetpack to fly off at any time and escape the attack. But he didn't, because just like his mother and father, he simply cared more about others than he did about himself. With the streets deserted of all residents, many gnolls began making their way towards the gates. The infestation growing as only Arlo and a few thorn-covered gates blocked the pile of predators building up along the low beachfront. Anara bypassed me without much as a word, running back down to the gates to help. Me, once again, being the only one there who wasn't in any way involved, alone and tired of being a useless observer who did nothing but watch her friends valiantly risk their lives while I just sat indecisively, still with fear. Trying to let go of that fear and use some of my puppetry to meddle and create disturbances on behalf of my team while they remained exposed, each of them willing to enter the more harmful side of these huge reinforced gates. Shooting wildly as he remained too unbalanced to aim and yet in an area too crowded to miss, Akoni found himself slowly sinking downwards into the very heart of the action, repelling these ghostly thick-nailed creatures with his cracking iridescent firework flares, blasting hot illuminating bolts from that hand cannon as his mystical blue and purple bolts collided against ground or foe like lightning and thunder. The super-hot metal plasma was interacting with cold atmosphere each time he struck an object, leaving a solar wind force that blew bright enough to eliminate these dark forces instantly from our world. Each bullet an exorcism that expelled these demonic aberrations in a flash, while residual light splashed on nearby creatures, pulling them furiously to the ground like gravity. The pressure of it severe enough for them to willingly claw off their own shrouds, and deliberately disappear into the unknown oblivion they had come from. Our skillful technician dropped down from flight beside Arlo, deciding more precision with his aim was a better compromise than staying above the gates where he could safely reign supreme. Touching the rubble of worn-torn ground, he unleashed the full potential of his new flare gun pistol, his fiery pellets lighting up the streets and melting holes in the bricks of house walls, as he managed to intimidate even the biggest clusters of this overbearing crowd into wild scatter. This small pocket of town becoming the only safe haven left amidst all the consuming foggy darkness. But Akoni's new invention had gone far from being unnoticed. His input had truly thrown a real spanner into the works as he continued to power down his jetpack and arc up that electric wristband and plasma pistol instead, forcing those once wrathful aggressors to feebly run for cover instead, creatures retreating to the marketplace to reunite with the rest of their pack. There was no question that Akoni's arrival had sparked a conflict amongst the pack of gnoll rooftop alphas, their apparent high command becoming much more distinct in my eyes as they began howling a whole new set of orders towards our horde, drawing the other gnolls' attention away from raiding and rummaging the spoils of abandoned houses, barking at them to abandon the streets and Market Square and head towards us and this high-hilled beach estate. Drone minions following the calls of these obvious overlords as they sat on the town's old rooftops as high as the hillside I stood upon. It occurred to me only then that I might have been the only nymph to ever witness these gnolls' sense of leadership and hierarchy, that there was in fact a level of command that might have gone greatly unnoticed, due to all of this cold blanketing fog that night always brought with it. I could understand why no one else had ever seen, nor mentioned, anything quite like this before. Most nymphs who have the misfortune of seeing a gnoll either jump straight to fight or flight, but never actually get the chance to study the creatures like I was doing right now from the back benches. This was a significant finding and an important piece of information that needed to be passed on, should I live long enough to tell someone about it. I noticed how two of the alpha gnolls became fed up with the amateurs in their dominion, choosing to jump from the rooftops on two legs in order to join the fight. Golden laces threaded into the lining of their shrouds made the alpha gnolls distinguishable from the rest. Shiny bright metal that reflected the fire's forceful shine, making them resistant against the crushing effects of gravity that our light seemed to have on the rest of their weaker leather-hooded brethren. Those two gnolls walked right past burning houses, unhindered by the light, their demonic pale white eyes fixed solely on Akoni and his flare gun. The minor gnolls ceased their attack completely when they noticed the alpha gnolls coming, widening the circle they'd made in a show of courteous respect towards their larger, upright walking kin. A sick feeling formed in the pit of my stomach, a gut feeling telling me that the princess' underestimation of these two, along with Akoni's own combat inexperience, was about to put them both in dire trouble. I knew I had to help them somehow, and rushed, without hesitation, downhill. I lost sight of them momentarily as I passed under the short sand dune drops and onto the flat level of the long thorny gates fencing. Clinging onto the thorny overgrowth of viney branches that coated these rusty steel poles, I quietly pushed aside the ivy in order to make a small peephole to look through, taking one last deep breath before reaching my hand towards the gate's opening latch. Something stopped me, however. At first, I thought it was Anara, warning me against such reckless behavior, but she was nowhere in sight. It was my own shadow blocking my hand and stopping me. Risen up like a tree from a pool of shade behind this fence, it had molded itself into a real-life sculpture of me, solid enough to grab my wrist and prevent me from opening that gate. I couldn't believe it. My own shadow was turning against me, disobeying the very master that was supposed to be in control of it. I'd had similar experiences like this in the past, my shadow having a mind of its own, always in times of great crisis. I always saw it as a subconscious manifestation of panic or alarm, like an overprotective parent warning me I was in serious danger and that I wasn't allowed to be in control of my own safety. I tried to pull away and resist it, but my shadow's grip was too strong. I couldn't do anything but watch as Akoni and Arlo faced off with the two gnolls. A dark dust began pouring from one of the gnolls' sleeves, camouflaging several small curved knives drawing from under this creature's caped leather coat. Made of blended silvery steel and bright luscious gold, these knives reminded me of the artificial talons on the gnolls' hands and feet. Sharp weapons that could pierce and sever. The gnoll started sadistically towards Akoni, twisting these blades out in taunt, fanning them in and out as a showcase of his talents. A weird type of smoke turning to mist as it fell out of the creature's shroud and disappeared before ever actually striking solid ground. There was no doubt in my mind this creature was another Sand King like Lord Aris. Had the gnolls we'd feared all these years been nothing more than nymphs like us in disguise? A clever militia put together by bandits and traitors in costumes? Merely posing as ravenous predators as a means of looting and stealing food supplies? This theory would explain a lot of things. Almost everything. Aris, why? Arlo asked in bewilderment, his words coated with anger, exhaustion, and utter disbelief. The gnoll's face was concealed under its hood, showing nothing but its beady white eyes. Could it really be Aris? I wondered in shock, glancing towards the marketplace, trying to spot Aris anywhere out there in that distance. Even though I never trusted him, I still felt completely shocked and betrayed. Arlo drawing arms to battle this bandit, only to have that second gnoll pull out a long gold sword no different to the blade Arlo had lost in the meadows yesterday. The gnoll then lunged at the prince with that sword, a complete level of precision and balance maintained as he swung and spun it about. Knives cracked off curved plates of armor as this epic 2-on-2 duel began. Aris enclosed himself in a storm of dust and daggers, smoke mixing with mist as he hurled knives at Akoni. Akoni rolled like a barrel on its side, his quick thinking only just saving his life. Akoni drew a bag of magic sand, some composite of white sand and black powder, from his slim tactical belt, while he electrically ignited as he knelt on his knees, this magic sandbag bursting and melting instantly into a glass kite-shaped shield that deflected the spray of sharp knives his quickly approaching adversary was throwing, deciding to fire his gun back at the charging man before he could close the distance between them completely. Akoni's chaotic and relentless spray of firepower randomly bounced and struck against every gate and corner. The hot ricocheting fairy flame had forced even me to duck for safety, only to pop my head up moments later and see that Akoni's scared and careless firing had hit the fence and burnt a few more peepholes directly into the bars. The metal-eating flame thankfully cut clean through the bars without igniting, as such an eruption would have been enough to instantly melt every organic thing along that fence. I had watched my own vaporized shadow reconstitute and solidify itself back to life. A tiny gold knife had become embedded in its body like a pin in a cushion. And as such, it was no longer restraining me, appearing almost as if it were aggravated by the knife that had stabbed it. My shadow then sifted through the gates and started running towards Aris and Akoni. Understandably afraid, Akoni jetted into the air in quick escape, taking only a short second to tinker with his armband, projecting holograms of himself that mirrored his every move as he retreated. Decoys most realistic, each of them doing just as he did, with but a second's delay. One bullet looking like 12 as he shot spouts of flame that appeared like they came from multiple directions in the sky, and yet all merged into one when they struck the floor in pursuit of Aris. Lord Aris was caught between bullets above and my knife-wielding shadow coming towards him from the side. He had no choice but to run and vanish in his all-consuming cloud of mist. "We need to get back, Arlo," said all versions of Akoni, who used his chance to send cover fire to separate Arlo from his fight with the other talented swordsman. "That's my sword," the prince stated with stern and stubborn cause, a ring of enemies surrounding him as he started through the purple and blue flames at the Alpha Gnoll. "I ain't leaving till I get it back," he then added, determined to remain despite the obvious danger. Hopping left and right as Arlo and the Gnoll frequently dived and clashed swords. The Gnoll seemed just as confident with the weight of the blade as Arlo was with his new one. They were like two mirror images combating each other. Flaming arrows pelted around the swordsman from a great unseen distance away, a reminder from our long-legged archer that there was still some resistance left on the other side of town. The vanguard's defiant hold of the tavern becoming more and more victorious as the majority of the Gnoll's forces seemed to be coming this way to deal with Arlo and Akoni. These lesser Gnolls and I were choosing to stand back and stalemate and only spectate the fight from afar. It was almost as if we'd pre-selected these men as our champions, and had come to some secret non-verbal arrangement to let this fight decide who the overall victor for the night would be. And so, Arlo, trying all his tricky swings and spinning sidekicks, blocked the last few strikes of his opponent, timing one weak spot in between parries in order to trip him over, so Arlo could bring his sword down from overhead with an intense warping of wind and sound. I felt butterflies release from my chest. The prince had the Gnoll pinned under his blade, which sat just inches from the Gnoll's hooded head. I was about to look away and check the skies for Akoni again, when in all but one glimpse, the Alpha Gnoll overpowered the prince and reverse elbowed him, right through the prince's own powerful deadlock. Strike after strike, the two continued to clash against each other, releasing their swords like rotating propellers. Strike after strike, the two continued to clash against each other, releasing their swords like rotating propellers as they spun freely amidst the air, throwing punches and sweeping at each other's legs, only to catch each other's sword by its spinning hilt and start fighting all over again, both of them thinking of the exact same technique each time they tried to outwit the other. But then the Gnoll thought of something completely new, suddenly dropping his sword and clapping his open hands together with an ear-piercing boom, the deafening blast bringing them both to their knees in agony. Neither I nor Arlo had any idea they could do that, and that minor second of doubt was all it took for the Alpha Gnoll to push Arlo with his thunderous strong hands into the very gate I was standing at, cracking the metal frames of his armor against the thorn-covered bars as they bent in absorption of Arlo's fierce impact into them, revealing just how powerful the force was he'd just been blindsided by. I dropped down, putting my hands through the gate, tugging and shaking Arlo in repetitive attempts to wake him. The Gnoll picked up his sword slowly, satisfied as he approached, readying himself for one final blow. "Wake up!" I yelled, still shaking Arlo, despite his eyes forever remaining shut. I was truly terrified. Never had I witnessed anything like what I'd just seen, or what I was about to see next. Akoni suddenly came back into view, choosing to reveal himself as he came to his friend's immediate defense, his holograms glitching and lagging behind and mirroring his moves, causing Akoni to reveal his exact position as he tried to shoot down the swordsman with faint flaring purple-blue sparks, his weakening warning shots not scaring the elite predator, as Akoni's fear of accidentally hitting the prince was interfering with his aim. The Gnoll paid no attention to him, continuing to stand over Arlo. Akoni dropped closer towards him, exposing himself further as he was baited further and further inwards by the swordsman. My shadow attacked the swordsman furiously, its small knife no match for the long swipes of Arlo's old recruitment blade, biting any and all time that it could. The Gnoll's blade continuously sliced my shadow over and over, each time dispersing it into two smaller portions of thinning paper blobs. Eventually there was nothing large or dense enough to take hold of the knife and deter the Alpha Gnoll's focus. He raised his sword for a final time, holding it over the prince as this shrouded stranger measured its own limits of mercy. My last line of defense being to raise my own hands up and build the blob of shadow left up like a mushroom, which popped and exploded, blocking the gnoll's vision with harmless black misty spores. The second alpha gnoll appeared from hiding, coming out from a depot of crates and through the mushroom's mist in a quick but stealthy stride, heading for a coney. "Look out!" I shouted, just as a gnoll grabbed him by the straps of his jetpack, ripping him down into the gravel as forcefully as possible. I was ready to uproar, new shadows coalescing from every shaded corner around, offering me their ghostly hands, coaching me to participate as my own private army began to fester and form on my side of the metal gates. My head was throbbing under the sickly concentration involved in bringing all these separate, threatening entities to life. A clay-like army of bodies shaking at the fence while Eris and his associate focused their attention squarely on the coney, completely ignoring what was sending most of the gnolls into fearful retreat. I reached out my hand, with no idea of what foolish heroics I was even trying to do. I had no battle plan and was running on pure instinct. There was a rustling noise, sounding much like my nimble princess diving and squeezing herself through the gate's small burn holes. I watched the partially invisible assailant using a priceless tiara crown as a club, striking it across the Sand King's head, bashing at the two alpha gnolls before they caught and disarmed her of it. It appeared all over for my friends. I and one bent rattling gate were all that was stopping this town from being under the gnoll's control. My shadows' combined shaking strength began to unhinge the gate, and they poured out to the other side. A hooded man with two gold-encrusted hands came out from the pack as he inspected the bounty his men had laid out for him. A mad, aggressive-seeming tribal chieftain, his arms all bruised and scratched, hands surprisingly skinny as they came out from the hooded cloak and into the house fire's distant light. Characteristics all evident of a man who had clearly lost his way, fresh wounds stitched up with gold nails and thread. Distinct features that could only be one madman, Midas. Midas had come to inspect the job his lieutenants had performed for him. None of them were actually speaking, but merely looking to one another as they retracted their weaponry. Midas was peering towards his son, who was crawling for escape. His broken jetpack, sparking and flaring as all its failsafes, seemed to be locking down, making it both hot and heavy as a coney wriggled to be free of it. Midas moved towards him, grabbing his son's leg, exposing more of his scalded and seeping gold skin, as, with great strength, he began dragging him away into the crowd of gnolls. I chased after a coney, my shadows tackling every gnoll that came towards me in protest. Suddenly, a loud war cry echoed and excelled outwards, multiple shouts and taunts coming out as our own army lit up this grim and groggy night sky. Midas and his army halted as they immediately twisted their heads towards the marketplace, hearing the sounds of spiders and soldiers pouring out of a bright azure blue portal gate. The residual light of the capital, brightening this town and bringing back our vision of the scope's halo roofing and the lighthouse Helios and his army were storming towards in order to temporarily illuminate this town once again. The gnolls all began scattering in retreat, fleeing from the virtuous bright lights of Helios and his glowing scepter, lighting up the middle streets and central tavern, disintegrating every enemy still trying to claw their way inside. Our white-bearded wary king was riding safely on a large spider steed, accompanied by his queen and all of her cavalry, releasing banshee screams at the gnolls and their own whimpering howls. I heard violent roars and war cries out in that distance, getting louder and louder as they seemed to be heading towards us. Lucky for me, this kept the gnolls very distracted, and I focused on drawing back every shadow I'd made and piled them onto the ground beside me. I decided to use the gnolls' fear of our spiders against them, and molded an egg from the shadows, imagining the squirming of worms and parasites eating at it from inside out. Midas's elite minions, finding this rocking egg unsettling and fearsome enough to briefly postpone their attacks upon me. Life for them becoming pure chaos, seeing as we were all so far outside of our comfort zones. The growing egg eventually erupted, all but Midas flinching as a flood of 1,000 tiny little black spiders spewed out of it, crawling across the ground like a flowing river of hairy, pygmy-sized insects. Many crawled up my arm as they melted and hardened to a carapace like shell of spiky armor. I ran with this flood of spiders, hoping this was enough to spook them into an uncontested safety. My scare tactic working better than I ever could have anticipated, with the gnolls all fleeing in terror. With everything in disarray, I weaved through the gnolls amidst a plague of mass hysteria. Midas and his 2 golden-tinted elites stood staring upwards, unamused, while watching me coming towards them. Midas simply was continuing to drag his son away, unfazed by these fake spiders crawling across his body and face, not bothering to mask his mouth or so much as flick a single one of them away. My efforts had failed to prevent the abduction of a coney, and out of sheer desperation, I began to turn some of the few spiders that laid over my arms into clumps of shady little snowballs, throwing them at this undeterred former king, morphing them into palm-sized dragonflies that sailed through the air and dove for his feet as they shackled around him like snagging tree root vines, and physically lashed his legs together in order to anchor him to parts of the erupted street rubble. Akoni was awake and free to escape, but he was battling to repair his broken jetpack and fuel generator, fearing it might become seriously life-threatening for all if it was allowed to heat up any more. Not impressed by my primitive but effective bindings, Midas turned to face me, his glare of pure hatred freezing me still, while Akoni unclipped his belt buckle and began forcing static charge into the fuses of his high-tech belt buckle, overloading this lightning device as if he meant it to be a bomb, eventually hurling it into the air as it frizzled with sparks, spitting out pulses of pure light and acting as a bright beacon to alert the soldiers of our need for help. The intensity of the device's raw charge was enough to evaporate most of the scourge in our immediate area, while unfortunately destroying all the shadows I had in my company. The light it emitted was like crushing gravity to these demonic beings. Even the elite golden-laced gnolls seemed to be forced to the ground with a heavy bout of pressure caused by the light. The rest of us stood blinded by the brightness, crawling to each other, waiting for it to dim down. Many of the gnolls were actively choosing to uncloak and simply disappear from this world in surrendering defeat. Arlo saw his moment to act. He flung back up and somersaulted towards his glossy diamond sword, quickly plunging it into the sword-slinging gnoll's chest before that cunning swordsman had a chance to respond in kind. Their eyes gazing disconcertingly to one another, Arlo's face turning ghostly pale and white thereafterwards. Right as he stared into the true face of that devilish entity, attempting to tug and keep his adversary from removing his hood, only to fail and have that creature humbly vanish to a great deal of white vapor and smoke. Milena and her soldiers saw all of this as they approached, the scarred, weathered face of Midas becoming visible from behind his hood, his solitary presence being all that was left of his ghost army. And so he stared furiously at his usurper queen and the rest of us all before pulling off his hood, dropping the gold horns of his old crown and vanishing from the brightening alley streets, unable to take any one of us with him, but still stubborn enough to be the very last of his army to leave the scene. Old Man Helios bombarded the area with radiant light from his staff. He was accompanied by the stablemaster hitching a ride on top of the gigantic brood mother's back, our enormous spider queen escorting Helios towards the lighthouse, our whole army at his back as they followed him up there in one giant movement. Astounded, I looked up to witness 2 of the alpha gnolls still up there watching from the rooftops, blocking stairs towards me before they too disappeared. The lighthouse reactivating thereafter, as Helios manually reflected his light using an octagon room of mirrors and windows, spreading shine across the entire town. Milena watched from the lighthouse porch as I dropped onto the floor beside Arlo. He was hurt badly, and she could tell this from the distance as I helped him lean against the crumbled and battered ivy gates. It seemed some of Ares's tiny knives had skimmed across him, and his armor was almost destroyed from the duel he had with that rival swordsman. Never in my history had I witnessed someone stronger and more talented than the prince with his own sword. So, the 2 of us just simply sat there. I didn't know whether it was best to lift him up with my shadows or run to bring the doctor over to him, figuring it smartest to check for Anara and have her see what I should do. But looking over to where Akoni sat, Anara was beside him, ready to offer him her help first. "No, don't," Akoni pleaded, his fingertips still sparking electricity as he lost the belt buckle fuse that he must have been using to funnel and contain his static charge. He got to his feet with relative ease by himself, embarrassed as he held a firm grip on his loose pants, having no choice but to wait for Anara to carefully hand him that power-packed belt. Slowly but surely, Anara picked it up and began clipping the steaming buckle pieces back together. Its fluid canisters were only half full with battery acid, the majority of the toxic liquid seeping and burning as it struck the ground, glowing incandescently with a rather calm and mesmerizing blue and white light. Anara gave me a small smirk as she walked over to me and patted her brother's back, her smile alone letting me know everything was going to be all right. With it, we could all accept that this nightmare was finally over. The conclusion made most confusing as I watched two soldiers drag Eris away in cuffs towards Milena. Looked at me with terror. "Kaya! Please, Kaya! Tell them I didn't do it. Tell them they've got the wrong man. Ask Odie. I didn't do this," he cried. I stared into his wide eyes without an inch of remorse, happy to see how scared he looked after everything he'd done to Arlo and me over these past few days.